I'm about to tell you a story about a supply chain failure. But this one is, well, it's so bizarre and so completely out of left field that it will probably change how you think about globalization forever. It's called the Sulfur Cascade, and it's the story of how one single choke point can trigger an invisible collapse across the entire globe. So let me ask you this. What could possibly connect a conflict in the Persian Gulf, a fertilizer plant in Morocco, and a copper smelter all the way over in Chile? I mean, on the surface, absolutely nothing, right? They're thousands of miles apart in totally different industries. But believe it or not, they are all linked by this fragile, hidden connection. And that connection, the real key to this whole puzzle, it isn't oil. It's not gas. It's something way more fundamental, and honestly, something most of us have never even thought about.
Okay, so let's pull back the curtain and meet this unlikely suspect.
Here it is, sulfur. You see, when oil and gas are pulled out of the ground, they're not clean. They're full of stuff that has to be removed. And this bright yellow powder is what's left over. For the energy companies, it's just a byproduct, not their main product at all. But for the rest of the world, it turns out to be absolutely essential.
So why is this stuff so important? Well, it gets converted into sulfuric acid, and you can think of that acid as a kind of chemical master key. It unlocks the hidden value in all sorts of raw materials. For instance, you can't just go sprinkle phosphate rock on a field and expect your crops to grow. It's basically useless like that. But hit it with some sulfuric acid, boom, you've just unlocked it, turning it into the fertilizer that literally feeds the world.
And this right here, this is the critical point. A massive 50%, half of all the sulfur that travels across the ocean comes from one single place, the Persian Gulf. Think about that. Half of the entire world's traded supply relies on that one region. So you can see the problem. When the only way out of that region, the Strait of Hormuz, gets blocked, the supply doesn't just get a little tight, it stops cold. The ships can't leave, the sulfur piles up at the refineries with absolutely nowhere to go. And just like that, half the world's supply is gone. It just vanishes. And this is where the cascade really begins. Let's walk through how this one choke point sets off a devastating chain reaction, a domino effect that ripples across entire continents. The whole thing unfolds in 4 key stages. First, the choke point closes, trapping the ships. Next, it hits Morocco's massive fertilizer industry. From there, the problem jumps to China, threatening both their food and their tech sectors. And then finally, China makes a move that turns a really bad crisis into a global catastrophe. Okay, domino number 1, Morocco. This country is home to OCP, the undisputed king of phosphate. We're talking 70% of all the world's reserves. But remember that master key? Without sulfur from the Gulf, OCP can't make its sulfuric acid. And without that key, its huge fertilizer plants just grind to a halt. Suddenly, farms all across Africa, South America, and Asia are cut off from the nutrients they need to grow food.
The next domino to fall is even bigger, China. As the world's #1 sulfur importer, it gets hit really hard. But here, the crisis actually splits into 2 separate problems. Of course, China needs sulfur for fertilizer, just like Morocco. But it also needs that same sulfuric acid to smelt copper. And copper is the metal that underpins our entire modern world. It's in our electronics, our EVs, our power grids. So all of a sudden, this isn't just about food anymore. Now it's about technology too. And then China does something that, from their perspective, is completely logical. But for the rest of the world, it's devastating. To protect its own industries, it just flat out bans all sulfur exports. And that single decision acts like a massive amplifier. It takes the shockwave from the Gulf and sends a second, even more powerful one across the planet. And the fallout is immediate. You've got major copper producers like Chile and Peru who are now totally stranded. They've been cut off from their 2 biggest suppliers. You've got key agricultural economies like Indonesia and Brazil facing critical shortages either of the raw sulfur or the finished fertilizer. The cascade has now officially gone global.
So the big question in all of this is, why didn't anybody see this coming? And this gets us to a much deeper point about the way our world works, our invisible fragility. You know, we usually think about risk in a very simple, linear way. If the oil supply gets disrupted, gas prices go up. Easy. That's an expected risk. But what the sulfur cascade showed us is a totally hidden kind of risk, these complex second-order effects. Nobody was thinking, oh, if oil refining slows down, the supply chain for copper wiring might break. It just wasn't on anyone's radar. And I'm not just saying that. Experts confirmed it. The NDSU Agricultural Trade Monitor put it perfectly, saying this revealed fragilities that no supply chain model anticipated. It was a true economic blind spot for everyone.
What happened here is the textbook definition of a cascade failure. A shock in one system, in this case oil and gas, travels along these hidden connections and triggers failures in systems that seem completely unrelated, like agriculture and electronics. All this interconnectedness makes our economy efficient, sure, but it also creates these deep, hidden vulnerabilities. All right, so after being caught so completely flat-footed by this, where do we go from here? How do we even begin to face this new kind of risk?
Well, the tough reality is we weren't prepared at all. I mean, there was a total policy void. Governments have strategic reserves of oil. We have strategic reserves of grain. The obvious stuff. But nobody, not one single government, had a strategic reserve of sulfur. There were no backup plans, no emergency committees. Everyone was completely and totally blindsided. And I think that leaves us with a really powerful idea to chew on. The global economy isn't just a bunch of supply chains. It's more like a web held together by all these invisible threads, these dependencies on byproducts we never, ever think about. The crisis in the Strait of Hormuz didn't just cut a supply line, it snapped one of those critical invisible threads. And now, we're just starting to figure out what was attached to it.
Which brings us to the final crucial question for all of us. Now that we've seen just how fragile these hidden connections really are, is it time we rethink what national security even means? Should governments start stockpiling critical industrial chemicals like sulfur the same way they stockpile oil? Honestly, it's a question we can no longer afford to ignore.